a little bit of totally reasonable platforming never hurt anybody. I usually tend to avoid doing videos on first-person shooters for this channel for a couple of reasons. One, it isn't really my genre. I didn't grow up playing a ton of first-person shooters, I'm not particularly good at them, and I just don't have the shooter brain. Second, my style of review a lot of the time kind of boils down games into their component parts, and when you do that with any first-person shooter, they all kind of turn into the same thing. Moving a mouse around on an XY axis and clicking on the badmin. Because of this, in order to really talk about a first-person shooter for longer than 3 minutes, it needs to have some other interesting things to offer. Luckily, G-String has plenty of things to offer. We should probably address this game's title first. I'm pretty sure the joke is supposed to be that the G-string in the game is an unfortunate name of a specific string of DNA, but this game actually has nothing to do with overpriced lingerie. I'm not really convinced how good of an idea this name was from an SEO perspective. Here's a fun experiment. Search G-string on literally any search engine and tell me what comes up. Okay, so we got an incognito tab for YouTube here. Already we have an ad for YouTube TV. The top picks for me seem to be all network TV shows. Mr. Beast asking me if I would sit in snakes for $10,000. Yes, I would probably do that. Let's try our luck here. Huh. Interesting. One of the first things that attracted me to this game was that it was developed by one person over the course of 12 years in the source engine. This developer even made all of the assets from scratch and wrote some pretty coherent world building solo. I fucking hate Googling anything about this game. Anytime I see a game that is this much of a passion for a solo developer, I feel like I'm sort of obligated to check it out. To me, solo devs like this, taking on absurdly ambitious projects, are sort of the ultimate expressions of game design as an art. It's one person forcing their vision into existing, using what is arguably the most difficult possible medium in order to do that, and dedicating large portions of their life to the work. In this game's description on Steam, we get this disclaimer. When work started on this project, I was going through difficult times, and G-String reflected this by touching on some troubling issues. This line immediately made me think about when I played through Hyperlight Drifter and realized the entire game was a complex allegory for the lead developer dealing with his potentially fatal heart condition, and I was interested in seeing what kind of anxieties and issues Ayara was going to get out of their system via developing this game. And they ended up being some very familiar ones that I've covered on the channel before. But before we get into more analytical stuff, let's cover the actual game. If I was going to be reductive, I would call G-String a Half-Life clone. You have a simple-looking UI with health and a suit that talks to you in a nice voice. You break boxes with a melee weapon / tool. You shoot the badmen in a dystopia. The main character is silent. Interacting with the physics engine is a large part of the game. The campaign is detailed and spaces out action sequences with exploration and platforming sequences. This is very much a child of Half-Life 2. In fact, I think this game is technically a full conversion mod for Half-Life 2, but in this case, even the term full conversion is kind of an understatement. I called the campaign detailed, and so did Ayara, but let me tell you, detailed is the understatement of the fucking decade. The level design in G-String is nothing short of psychotic in how detailed it really is. You never really feel like a protagonist in G-String. You just feel like you got dropped into a world that would have existed whether or not you showed up and has no interest in explaining itself to you or helping you out in any way. There's a concept in level design called conveyance. Conveyance is how the game tells the player where to go. Depending on the level, G-string treats the idea of conveyance with heavy sarcasm or outright contempt. Sometimes if you're lucky, you might figure out where to go by noticing a slightly open ventilation shaft or a crawl space, and other times you will expect it to do something insane.
Okay, let's hear that one again.
Other times you will expect it to do something insane.
Okay, so now the question is, do I go back and fix that in the script, or do I do one of those ironic video editing software bits?
This game is built in the Source engine, which is notorious for its physics simulations. Because of this, literally every object and every tiny little greeble on the side of every building has a collider on it, and can technically be walked on or jumped off of. This means you need to be looking for things like odd wires you can tightrope on to get to the next part of the level that in other games would just be set dressing. You need to be meticulously checking every detail of the environment to figure out where your next opportunity to progress is. And while this seems like it would be tedious or boring, it's anything but. G-string is very heavily resource-based, and the more you explore, the more ammo, health, and suit power you're going to find, which will make your life a lot easier. Combat, even on the standard difficulty, can be pretty unforgiving, so odds are even if this game had big red arrows pointing to where you needed to go in every level, you probably would be exploring every corner for more items anyway. You were already going to be heavily rewarded for engaging with the environment, so why not just go all the way and tie progression to that same level of heavy engagement? Not to mention if you're the kind of person that likes immersion in video games, this is about as immersive as it gets. Not to sound too much like an IGN hack, but because of that thing I said earlier about the world not giving a shit if you're in it or not, you really feel like an 18-year-old telekinetic Korean girl lost in a cyberpunk dystopia. If you're really paying close attention, you might even find certain weapons earlier than normal, like this time where I'm pretty sure I found what is basically this game's version of a revolver early by noticing it sitting on a box and shooting it through a window with my brain force so I could go pick it up. I also had an opportunity to get the shotgun early out of the storage room, but accidentally finished the level before I could figure out how to get it. By this point in the video, you're probably wondering what the fuck I'm talking about with the telekinetic stuff. Basically, your ability to pick up objects and move them around or throw them and generally mess with the game's physics and solve certain environmental puzzles are given to you via your telekinetic powers, which more or less take the place of the Half-Life 2 gravity gun. This obviously opens up all sorts of possibilities, like spending 25 minutes stacking a bunch of pointless props into a big pile to jump on top of a bookshelf for a couple extra pickups. These kinds of environmental puzzles are key to progressing in G-string, and a lot of the time they're going to be very subtle, which also ties back into how detailed the game's world is. Always be on the lookout for a panel you can shoot, or weird blockage that looks like it could be destroyed. There were a lot of times where I would get stuck in a level for quite a while before I noticed some small irregularity and realized that it was my chance to get to the next level. Which brings me to my next point. I'm pretty sure every level in this game, or at least some sizable percentage of them, have multiple exits and pathways to finish them. The levels are very complex, and it seems extremely unlikely to me that I would always happen to just pick the right fork in the road 100% of the time for my whole playthrough. The description also mentions this. This should give the game a fair amount of replayability, since I imagine it's possible to play through the game a second or a third time and still be finding new areas you missed in previous playthroughs. And of course, since this is a first-person shooter, we need to talk about the actual shooting, which is pretty good. I'm happy to report that the shotgun feels good, which really is the most important test in any single-player first-person shooter. At first, gunplay feels kind of bad because the weapons you start out with are very weak and the enemies take on a little bit too much of a bullet sponge quality, but getting farther into the game and getting stronger weapons will eventually lead to you killing most enemies in one shot, which not only adds a satisfying sense of realism, but also gives the gunplay a nice progression arc where you feel like you're getting noticeably stronger over time. If I was going to levy any real complaint at actual gunplay in G-String, it would probably be that the sound design doesn't sound the best, but this seems like a gripe that isn't really worth making in a game made by a solo dev that was also very obviously and intentionally trying to make the game feel retro. That being said, I still wasn't that big of a fan of the SMG. Another interesting aspect of gunplay that I felt was sort of unique to G-String is that the enemy placement is very strange in the context of this being a video game. There will be many points where you're in urban areas and enemies are very far off in the distance or obscured on rooftops and other difficult to see areas. Usually in video games, enemies are sort of presented to you directly, but in G-String, they are given much more realistic placement, as if they are actually kind of worried about being shot at. This really ramps up the feeling of genuinely being in urban combat, which I thought was a great approach. And once again, it feels as if the game's world is totally indifferent to you being there. These soldiers aren't coming after you, you just happens to be here and see their operation. This also means there are a lot of times where trying to shoot at obscured or distant enemies just isn't worth the time and effort, and it's better just to run and move on. It isn't always in your best interest to get into a long gunfight, especially with how resource-based this game's combat is. I imagine that on higher difficulties, choosing your battles is even more important. Just based on what I've talked about so far, it would be very easy for me to recommend this game to anyone who likes single-player first-person shooters or anyone that enjoyed the Half-Life franchise. The quality and detail of level design is something that is genuinely difficult to imagine one person doing, and the potential replayability and generally fun gunplay makes this kind of a slam dunk. But there's a lot of other stuff going on under the surface in G-String that somehow manages to elevate it even further. G-String takes place in what could probably be described as a cyberpunk dystopia, but this is a dystopia that is really on its last leg. In a setting like Cyberpunk 2077, things are definitely not good, but people and society are still sort of functioning on a day-to-day level. G-String is a much more advanced dystopia. Cities are completely bombed out and no one really has the resources to fix them. The entire global banking and financial sector has completely collapsed. The only guy that had gold that currency could be backed by just had his entire gold depot destroyed. Everyone is at war all the time. The air is unbreathable, acid rain is polluting everything all the time, and most species are extinct. This is the end for humanity. They have one foot in the grave and the other one on a cartoon oil slick. It's not looking good. Now, if this game had been made by a less visionary developer, we could imagine all this information being given to us through a text scroll or some obnoxious in-game lore dumps, but this game takes a much more subtle approach. Real quick correction for the brain geniuses in the comments. Yes, technically this game starts out with a text scroll, but this is like the tip of the iceberg of shit that is going on in this game. In my video on Cyberpunk 2077, I mentioned that cyberpunk media usually tends to have a very specific tone, and part of that tone is just dropping the player or the reader or the viewer into a world and forcing them to figure it out on their own. As you can probably imagine based on my description of G-String's level design, this is exactly what the game does. Instead of getting outright obvious explanations of who and what everything is, it's up to you as the player to sort of observe the dystopian white noise around you and figure it out. The game will often throw things at you like these grim PSAs about the world's two-child policy.
Favor sexual relations with synthetic companions. Use birth control when engaged
Another example of this that you will find that is one of my personal favorite aspects of the game is the brilliantly pointed and well-designed graffiti. I should have some footage here that shows off some of my favorite graffiti designs in the game. I especially enjoy this UFO one. I don't know if you've noticed on Twitter, but I'm kind of a UFO guy. I don't want to dwell too much on this part of the script, because at a certain point I'll just be kind of rehashing everything I said about world building in my Cyberpunk 2077 video. Instead, what I am going to dwell on is the world building in G-String in the context of what I've been saying about this game's indifference to the player, which is something a little bit more unique. This part is going to give an outline of the game's levels and general plot, so if you want to skip spoilers about that kind of stuff, skip to here. G-String opens up here, in a lab where the main character, Mio Hiyori, an 18-year-old Korean girl, is basically being treated as a lab rat and having her telekinetic abilities studied. She is able to escape the lab, not because of anything she does, but because a piece of space debris from an orbital battle happens to land on the lab, damaging it, allowing her to escape. You escape into the streets of one of the worst parts of the city, and by complete accident, wander into this robot ghetto where a rogue AI is trying to start a war against humanity. By total coincidence, you get trapped here with the AI and have to destroy it. But continuing your way through the city, you just happen to get caught up with some rebels who are trying to get a revolution off the ground in the streets. Eventually, you goof your way up into an air refinery in the lower atmosphere by complete chance, and when you get back down to the surface, a hacker who has hacked into your suit to try and help you is like, maybe you should leave Earth and go to the colony on Mars.
You close to the spaceport? Hey, I have an idea. Why don't you ditch this rock? So I'd do in your shoes. Believe me, these guys aren't going to give up down here. Try to get to Mars. Got the moon.
This is the only time in the game that we ever get any actual direction or objective as the player. After this, you try to stow away on a cargo ship, but that ship is attacked by rebels, so you get sent back down to Earth in an escape pod. But then, you're finally captured by the lab you escaped from and taken to their tower, where you manage to escape again, but are tricked into a space elevator that lifts you up into orbit, where you're captured by the military force that has been fighting you this whole time. But the military ship that you're on gets attacked, and you happen to find a rebel pilot who crashed into the ship, and he's like, take my ship and get out of here. And then you find yourself in an accidental, low-orbit Star Wars-style space battle, shooting at massive destroyers. This entire game can basically be described as an 18-year-old Korean girl Forrest Gumping her way through the dystopia. You sort of get the feeling that all of these events were going to happen no matter what. The rebels and the fascist surveillance state were going to fight in the streets. The orbital laser strikes on the city were always going to happen. The attack on the cargo ship and the attack on the destroyer you were on later were always going to happen. You existing in this world doesn't really seem to matter all that much, and the end seems to have a similar indifference towards the actions of the player. What you do doesn't really have that much of an impact in the game, but instead of being because the developer was a hack and didn't really think about it or write it well, it's because the entire point of the game is that, of course, one person isn't going to be able to meaningfully make a difference in a world that is already on the brink of complete human extinction. Of course, one Korean kid in a supersuit isn't going to be able to just undo God knows how many centuries of human mistakes. You don't matter, because that's the point of the game. There is also just an implication of scale that is completely beyond you as an individual for most of the game. There are several times in G-String where you're just stuck in an elevator or a train ride or are waiting for a ship to take off, where you're just kind of stuck looking at the very obviously Blade Runner-inspired world outside that seems to infinitely expand out into the distance. These sections can last a couple minutes, and the game doesn't really care that you want to keep playing it. You need to wait for the trip to be over. Sorry, protagonist. Some people might find these sections annoying or boring, but I generally liked them, and the detail that was put into the buildings and the cityscapes is pretty incredible. Plus, they usually give you some nice music to pass the time.
Hey, kid, you're moving north fast. What's happening?
Alright, the spoilers are over, let's get into the conclusion. G-String is an excellent game. Not only is the level design absurdly detailed and ambitious, and not only is the gunplay fun and interesting, but the game's emotional tone and broader commentary is also delivered in a way that is subtle and unpretentious. I think these days all of us are kind of struggling with feeling like we aren't the protagonist in this story, and that we're kind of cursed to watch the world around us get worse. I imagine this is the exact feeling Ayara was trying to capture with G-String, and it was done exceedingly well and follows in the footsteps of all the great dystopian media that preceded it. People often say that no game is perfect, and that might be true, but put into the context of this game being made by one person over the span of 12 years, I'm not really sure how much better it could have been. If you're in the market for an excellent single-player first-person shooter with a surreal and thought-provoking world and story, then I highly recommend G-String. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing. You can also leave a like and a comment, which really help out. And if you're already subscribed, hit the bell. I also have a Discord community that you can join with a link down in the description. And recently, I got a new Twitch account up and running as well, where I will be streaming from time to time. So make sure you head over to Twitch with a link that is also in the description and follow me there. And finally, follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.